In October 2018, the quiet town of Barron in northern Wisconsin was settling into the early cold of winter. It was a place where nightly routines rarely changed, and unexpected events were almost unheard of. Yet, in the middle of one ordinary night, a brief emergency call came from a familiar home, followed by the unexplained disappearance of a 13-year-old girl. No witnesses saw a vehicle leaving, no neighbors heard anything unusual, and no early lead pointed to a direction of travel. In a community built on predictability, one question emerged: how can a child vanish in just a few minutes? Within that environment, the Kloss residence stood slightly removed from the main cluster of homes, positioned along a modest driveway branching off Highway 8. The house was simple, maintained, and consistently illuminated during early evening hours. James and Denise Kloss, both longtime employees at a nearby food processing plant, lived a quiet life with their only child, 13-year-old Jamie. Their schedules were routine: long workdays, early nights, and limited social engagements. Neighbors described them as reserved but dependable, not involved in conflicts, and not known to attract unwanted attention. Jamie, who attended the local middle school, was characterized by teachers as polite, calm, and academically steady. Her peers perceived her as quiet but approachable, someone who avoided drawing attention yet showed willingness to assist when asked. At home, she typically helped her mother with small tasks, maintained her own room, and rarely went anywhere alone after dark. There were no signs that the family anticipated any form of threat, nor did they report suspicious activity in the months leading up to the incident. October in Barron marked the early descent into winter. Evening temperatures dropped sharply, leaving thin frost across the lawns each morning. Most families focused on preparing for the colder season rather than worrying about safety. Doors were locked out of habit rather than fear, and homeowners seldom installed advanced security systems. The Kloss house followed similar patterns: basic exterior lighting, standard locks, and no added surveillance equipment. On the night of October 14th, leading into October 15th, 2018, the area surrounding the Kloss residence remained still. The lights inside the home suggested the family had not yet gone to bed, though activity appeared minimal. It was around this time, later determined to be shortly before 12:53 a.m., that an unfamiliar vehicle arrived at the end of the driveway. Investigators would later conclude that the vehicle's headlights were deliberately minimized and its rear license area obscured, indicating intentional preparation by the driver. James likely noticed movement outside. The layout of the house allowed a clear view from the front door toward the driveway, and he stepped forward to assess the situation. Through the glass pane of the door, he could see a figure in dark outerwear, with the head covered by what resembled a winter mask. The individual did not display identification, nor did he provide a reason for being there. Statements later recovered in interviews suggest that a verbal exchange occurred in which James requested the person to identify himself before any door was opened. The response from the unidentified man was abrupt and forceful, demanding the door be opened without further questioning. What followed, based on physical evidence and reconstruction, was a rapid escalation. The sound recorded indirectly through background noise during the later 911 call aligns with a loud impact at the front entry area, suggesting a forced attempt to breach the door. Inside the house, Denise reacted immediately upon hearing the disturbance. She guided Jamie into the bathroom, one of the few rooms in the home with a functional lock. In the brief seconds that followed, Denise managed to place a call to 911. The dispatcher received an open line call at 12:53 a.m. The recording contained no verbal message, but did capture noise consistent with hurried movement and raised voices. Attempts by the dispatcher to call back were unsuccessful, leading to the call being classified as a priority response. The bathroom door remained locked for only a short time. The door was not reinforced, and the person entering the home applied enough force to compromise it quickly. According to later forensic analysis, there were minimal objects inside the room capable of prolonging resistance. Jamie, at 13 years old, had no practical means of defending herself. The sequence of actions that took place inside the room unfolded rapidly and left little physical trace beyond signs of struggle, consistent with a brief attempt to shield the child. Evidence indicates that Jamie was restrained swiftly. The type of binding material recovered at the property after the case was resolved matched marks found at the Kloss residence that night. The intruder moved with purpose, demonstrating familiarity with rapid control tactics. The entire process, from entry into the home to removing Jamie, lasted only a few minutes, leaving almost no opportunity for escape or for additional calls for help. Jamie was taken from the bathroom, through the hallway, and out of the house toward the waiting vehicle. Indentations in the grass and small traces along the path suggested this movement occurred quickly and without significant deviation. She was placed in the trunk area of the vehicle, concealed from outside view. The car exited the property almost immediately after. At the same time, local deputies were already en route. Responding to the open line 911 call, they arrived at the residence just 4 minutes after the initial contact. Their rapid response, however, was insufficient to intercept the departing vehicle, which had left the scene and merged onto nearby roads moments before units reached the driveway. Upon entering the home, deputies discovered the front door, partially open, and signs that an intruder had forced entry. Interior lights remained on, but the house itself was silent. The bathroom showed unmistakable indications that a struggle had occurred, but there was no sign of Jamie anywhere inside or around the property. Deputies expanded their search to the perimeter, but found no direction of travel, no discarded items, and no footprints clear enough to determine a route. Within less than 10 minutes after Jamie was taken, the case transitioned from a disturbance response to a confirmed disappearance. The absence of eyewitnesses and the speed with which the event unfolded left investigators with an initial scene that raised more questions than answers. The only concrete information at that moment was the timestamp of the 911 call and the fact that a 13-year-old girl was no longer inside the home. The initial law enforcement response on the morning of October 15, 2018, proceeded in accordance with standard protocol for an open-line emergency call paired with signs of forced entry. Deputies from the Barron County Sheriff's Department performed a sweep of the residence as soon as they determined no immediate threat remained inside. They confirmed the absence of Jamie Kloss within minutes. The front entry area displayed clear indications of forced access, and the bathroom exhibited evidence of a rapid confrontation. These observations helped narrow the timeline. The intruder had acted decisively, spent very limited time inside the house, and left with a single objective. The first operational priority became establishing whether Jamie had left voluntarily, something procedure required investigators to rule out, despite the highly probable conclusion that she had been taken. Given her age and the physical state of the scene, the hypothesis of voluntary departure was quickly dismissed. Patrol deputies marked off the perimeter with tape and began documenting all observable tracks, tire impressions, and environmental details. The driveway gravel contained several vehicle impressions, but heavy use by the family vehicles and prior visitors made it difficult to isolate the pattern of the departing car. Investigators noted that the direction of travel could not be determined with certainty due to the absence of fresh tire marks on the asphalt beyond the driveway exit. Within an hour, detectives from the Sheriff's Department and agents from the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigation arrived to take over. They performed a detailed walkthrough, marking the position of every item that might later assist reconstruction. A forensic team collected samples from door frames, floor surfaces, and soft materials that showed signs of pressure or disturbance. The evidence gathered from the bathroom confirmed the presence of adhesive material consistent with bindings. However, the amount of physical trace left by the intruder was minimal, suggesting deliberate efforts to avoid contamination or a familiarity with quick operations that did not rely on prolonged contact. At 3:30 a.m., additional deputies began canvassing the immediate vicinity, moving house to house to identify potential witnesses. Many residents were asleep at the time of the incident, and the rural spacing between homes limited the likelihood of direct observation. Two neighbors reported hearing loud noises, described as something sharp or abrupt, but both believed it was related to routine seasonal activities or night hunting, which was not uncommon in the region. Neither had observed vehicles approaching or leaving the property. By early morning, the sheriff's department declared Jamie Kloss an endangered missing juvenile, triggering state-level cooperation. A request for federal assistance was made shortly after sunrise. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment, CARD team, reviewed the initial evidence and advised widening the search radius beyond the immediate area. Flyers, digital bulletins, and early media alerts were prepared, emphasizing Jamie's age, appearance, and the urgent need for public information. When daylight arrived, ground searches were conducted along both sides of Highway 8, extending into nearby wooded areas and drainage ditches. Volunteers began gathering outside the command post, though authorities initially limited participation until search patterns were established. The air temperature remained low, slowing decomposition of potential trace materials, but also limiting activity from anyone who might have been outdoors during the hours before dawn. K-9 units were deployed around 9 a.m., but dogs were unable to track a definitive route beyond the driveway, suggesting Jamie had been placed in a vehicle rather than led or carried away on foot for any significant distance. As the morning progressed, Denise's 911 call became one of the most valuable early leads. Analysts isolated background noise and attempted to separate voices, impacts, and motion. While the call did not capture coherent speech from any party, the patterns were consistent with a rapid intrusion and a struggle localized to a confined room. The call's timestamp confirmed the intruder's presence, but provided no clues regarding identity, motive, or direction of flight. Throughout the morning, deputies secured surveillance footage from local businesses and traffic-facing cameras within a several-mile radius. However, Barron's sparse camera coverage limited the usefulness of this step. A few recordings captured partial images of vehicles passing in the relevant window of time, but none were clear enough to offer immediate identification. The sheriff's department also contacted nearby counties seeking any traffic stop data or unusual vehicle reports from the hours surrounding the incident. No meaningful connections emerged. At midday, the sheriff's office held its first press briefing. The statement remained cautious, offering only confirmed facts. A juvenile missing under urgent circumstances, an active investigation, and no evidence at that stage to suggest Jamie had been harmed after being taken. Authorities refrained from discussing specific details from the interior of the house, noting that premature disclosure could compromise the investigation. Journalists pressed for information about whether the case was believed to involve someone known to the family, but the official position remained neutral. Investigators at that time had not ruled out any category of suspect. Meanwhile, forensic examiners continued processing the residence. They cataloged footwear impressions on tile surfaces, compared fibers found near the bathroom threshold, and examined the adhesive fragments to determine brand and purchase traceability. Unfortunately, the adhesive was a common household type sold widely, reducing its value as a unique identifier. The absence of fingerprints added to the challenge. It was unclear whether the intruder had worn gloves or simply touched very few surfaces. In the early afternoon, detectives conducted interviews with extended family members, co-workers of James and Denise, and several of Jamie's teachers. The goal was to identify any recent conflicts, financial strain, personal disputes, or unusual behavior that might point to a motive. All accounts described the family as stable, private, and without known adversaries. Jamie had not reported being followed, approached, or contacted by strangers during school hours. Her digital accounts showed no suspicious communication in the days preceding the disappearance. With no identifiable personal motive emerging, the working theories shifted toward a targeted abduction by an unknown individual or a random act committed by someone from outside the community. By late afternoon, federal agents reviewed geographic and behavioral patterns to assess the likelihood of an offender traveling from within or outside the region. The absence of ransacking or speculative entry indicated a focused intent. The intruder's certainty in moving through the house suggested prior observation or a pre-planned objective. However, investigators lacked any direct evidence of surveillance activity in the days before the incident. The case remained without a viable suspect. As daylight faded, the search radius was expanded to include additional rural roads and isolated structures. Patrol vehicles maintained presence on nearby intersections to watch for abandoned items or signs that Jamie might have been left outdoors. Nothing consistent with her belongings or clothing was found. The absence of discarded materials hinted that the intruder retained control over the situation throughout transport. That evening, law enforcement issued a nationwide missing child alert. Media coverage intensified, prompting a surge of public tips. Most tips were speculative or based on mistaken sightings. Several callers suggested possible vehicles they believed matched what they saw near the highway, but none aligned with the limited information investigators held. Inside the command center, detectives reviewed the timeline repeatedly. From the moment of the 911 call to the arrival of deputies, only 4 minutes had passed. The intruder had departed so quickly that even if a patrol car had crossed paths with the vehicle, officers might not have realized its relevance unless there were obvious signs. Multiple units reported encountering vehicles during that time frame, but none showed erratic behavior or reason for detention. By the end of the first 24 hours, the investigation had produced a detailed reconstruction of the incident, but no identifiable suspect, no confirmed direction of escape, and no evidence of where Jamie might have been taken. The working assessment concluded that she was removed from the residence in a controlled manner and transported by vehicle to an unknown location. The days immediately after Jamie Kloss's disappearance established a structure that would persist for weeks: coordinated searches, methodical interviews, and a continuously expanding circle of inquiry. Yet despite the intensity of the early efforts, investigators realized by the end of the first week that they faced a case with extremely limited direction. The primary challenge remained unchanged from the moment deputies entered the home. There were no eyewitnesses, no clear suspect pool, and no physical trail extending beyond the driveway. During the second and third days, search parties grew substantially as volunteers from surrounding counties arrived to assist. Fields, wooded areas, drainage culverts, and abandoned structures were examined with grid-based precision. Teams were organized into disciplined lines spaced at consistent intervals, marking progress with flags and communicating findings through radio updates. Nothing connected to Jamie emerged. No clothing, no objects, no footprints leading away from the main road. The absence of trace materials produced a subtle but significant psychological shift among investigators. Cases involving missing children often reveal small indicators early on. The lack of such indicators pointed to a controlled abduction executed by someone who minimized exposure and left quickly. While ground searches continued, detectives maintained an aggressive interview schedule. Friends, extended relatives, school officials, neighbors, and co-workers of the Kloss family were questioned at length. Investigators looked for conflicts at work, financial disputes, interpersonal tension, or anything that might suggest a targeted motive. All findings were consistent with the initial profile. The family maintained a quiet, predictable life without known threats or adversaries. No evidence surfaced to suggest domestic disputes, secret relationships, debts, or prior complaints against any individual. The possibility of an offender acting without personal connection gained increasing weight. In parallel, digital forensic teams examined communication records. Jamie's phone activity showed nothing irregular. Her online interactions were typical for a teenager: brief exchanges with classmates, school-related messages, and benign searches. There was no indication she had been contacted by an unknown individual or lured in any manner. Denise and James likewise showed no suspicious online communication. Their accounts displayed predictable patterns tied to work schedules and daily routine. Despite the overall lack of progress, small leads emerged through public reporting. One tip described a vehicle seen leaving the general area around the time of the incident. Another caller reported a vehicle parked near a junction west of the Kloss residence earlier that night. Yet none of these accounts provided specific identifying elements, such as a plate number, a distinctive mark, or a confirmed direction of travel. Investigators pursued each tip fully, but without corroboration. None reached the threshold for probable cause. Within 1 week, national media attention intensified. News stations covered the disappearance through repeated segments, amplifying public pressure to identify a suspect. The sheriff's department managed briefings carefully, releasing only what was verified to avoid speculation. Still, rumors began to circulate across online forums. Claims of sightings, theories about involvement from distant relatives, and unfounded assumptions regarding the family's routine. Detectives monitored these discussions but treated them cautiously. The volume of incorrect information increased investigator workload without adding meaningful progress. By the end of October, the case entered what professionals often describe as the transitional period between an active hot pursuit and the beginning of a cold phase. Search teams were scaled down, though still redeployed periodically when new information suggested checking specific areas. Helicopter flyovers, thermal imaging sweeps, and drone-assisted scans became part of scheduled operations rather than emergency measures. The investigation shifted toward strategic analysis rather than immediate response. One development occurred during the second week. An individual attempted to enter the Kloss home during the family's absence. Deputies apprehended him shortly after. He was found to have taken some of Jamie's clothing. Although the discovery initially created urgency, detectives quickly determined he had no involvement in the original incident. His motive was unrelated, and there was no indication he had any knowledge of the events of October 15th. Despite this, the intrusion served as a reminder of the case's growing public visibility and the need to manage the scene carefully. Throughout November, detectives reassessed the initial crime scene. They revisited the 911 recording, re-examined the structure of the home, clarified timelines with additional witness interviews, and cross-checked every minor detail. The aim was to identify something that might have been overlooked in the chaotic early hours. Although no new evidence surfaced, one conclusion grew more certain. The intruder had targeted the residence with focus. The rapid entry, minimal interaction with the interior, and swift departure indicated someone who had planned the sequence rather than acting impulsively. However, this observation provided no direct path toward identifying the person responsible. Another area of focus involved the family's workplace. Agents evaluated logs, schedules, and any potential disputes at the facility where James and Denise worked. Supervisors and co-workers provided consistent statements. The couple did not report conflict, did not exhibit unusual behavior, and did not mention concerns about personal safety. No incidents at the workplace pointed toward retaliation or connection to the events at the home. Investigators eliminated professional motives as a primary direction. In mid-November, the case's geographic analysis expanded into a broader radius. Detectives examined cabins, rental properties, seasonal homes, and remote structures in Barron County and neighboring regions. Some properties were visited based on tips, others based on proximity to roads with minimal surveillance. These checks required coordination with local departments across several jurisdictions. Again, no trace of Jamie was found. By Thanksgiving, daily operations had slowed, though the case remained a top priority. The Sheriff's Department maintained a dedicated command center, where investigators rotated through shifts to review tips, track leads, and coordinate with federal partners. The FBI continued to analyze background patterns, but the absence of behavioral indicators made profiling difficult. The lack of communication from the abductor, no calls, no messages, no demands, reduced the probability of a ransom scenario and supported the theory of a concealed holding location outside populated areas. As December approached, public sentiment oscillated between hope and resignation. Media stories often highlighted the lack of progress, while community members held vigils and gatherings to express support for Jamie's return. Her image remained visible in stores, community boards, and digital billboards. Investigators monitored each event, aware that increased visibility might generate new tips, but also aware that time was working against them. During the third week of December, detectives reviewed a mass of digital submissions from the public. Among them were reports of possible social media sightings, photos from other states showing girls who resembled Jamie. Each was checked thoroughly. None matched. The volume of misinformation continued to grow, producing additional strain on limited investigative resources. When winter deepened and snow accumulated, ground searches became impractical in certain areas. Weather limitations forced a shift from physical sweeps to analytical work. Detectives compiled behavioral timelines for individuals who lived or worked near the Kloss residence. Vehicle records were checked against all documented movement on surrounding roads. Gas station footage from multiple counties was requested, though the hours of review yielded little. By the final days of December, the case had quieted externally, but remained active behind the scenes. Detectives still met daily, still processed incoming information, and still considered the possibility that Jamie might be held within reachable distance. The lack of evidence showing harm sustained hope among investigators, though they avoided expressing assumptions publicly. As the year ended, the investigation reached the point often described as the cold plateau, a state where the case no longer produced actionable leads, but remained unresolved. It stayed open on every desk involved. The question was not whether Jamie was missing. This was established from the first moment. But where she had been taken, by whom, and for what purpose? None of those answers were yet known. By early January 2019, the investigation had settled into a routine defined by periodic tip reviews and continued reevaluation of existing information. The cold winter landscape limited further ground searches, and with no credible sightings, no communication from an offender, and no traceable pattern of behavior emerging from public input, the case remained suspended in a state of uncertainty. It was during this period, seemingly the quietest phase of the investigation, that the decisive event occurred. The breakthrough did not originate from law enforcement strategy, surveillance technology, or an external informant. It came from Jamie herself. On the afternoon of January 10, 2019, in the remote community of Gordon, Wisconsin, approximately 70 miles north of Barron, a resident named Jean Nutter set out for a routine walk with her dog, along a lightly used road. The area consisted predominantly of seasonal cabins, forested lots, and long stretches of unoccupied land. Few pedestrians were typically seen during winter months, and those who did venture out usually kept to short paths. As Nutter proceeded along the road, she noticed a small figure emerging from the tree line. The figure moved with urgency, but not in a chaotic manner, as though driven by a clear objective. When the child drew closer, Nutter realized she recognized the girl from months of news coverage. Jamie identified herself immediately and asked for help. Nutter later reported that Jamie spoke with clarity and directness, despite appearing thin, visibly shaken, and dressed inadequately for the temperature. The absence of footwear suitable for snow, along with the mismatched clothing, reinforced Nutter's early assumption that Jamie had not come from a nearby home on a voluntary walk. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, Nutter chose not to use her own home, located nearby, for safety concerns, instead leading Jamie to the residence of neighbors who were present and able to call authorities. When the neighbors opened their door, Jamie again stated her name and provided a brief but critical piece of information: the name of the man who had taken her. She also explained that he was not present at the time she fled. Despite her calm tone, she remained visibly disoriented, a natural response to suddenly transitioning from confinement to open space after a prolonged period. The neighbors immediately contacted emergency dispatchers, reporting that Jamie Kloss had been found alive. The call reached dispatchers at approximately 4:45 p.m. Responding units were briefed en route, and the description provided by Jamie, including the name of the individual and a general description of the vehicle, allowed deputies to establish a rapid containment strategy around the surrounding roads. Based on her statement, it was believed the suspect might attempt to locate her once he discovered she was gone. Deputies were instructed to monitor all vehicles leaving the area and to proceed cautiously, as the suspect was believed to have previously shown the ability to act decisively. Within minutes of the dispatch, a patrol unit observed a vehicle matching the description Jamie had provided. The vehicle was traveling along a nearby road, not speeding, not attempting evasive action, and displaying no outward indication that the driver was aware of law enforcement presence. Deputies initiated a traffic stop. The driver exited upon instruction. When asked to identify himself, he stated without hesitation, "I'm Jake Patterson." Moments later, he added, "I did it." The deputies secured him without resistance. Back in Gordon, Jamie was escorted by deputies to a designated safe location. Medical personnel performed an initial assessment. While she exhibited signs of fatigue and stress, there were no immediate indicators of injuries requiring hospitalization. Her ability to recount essential details surprised investigators, though they remained cautious not to overwhelm her with questions. Priorities were safety, stabilization, and establishing a structured environment for eventual formal interviews. The information she provided in those early moments formed the basis for the first investigative reassessment since October. She explained that she had been held in a residence just a short distance from where she was found, concealed in a manner designed to avoid detection from visitors. She described the pattern of confinement: being kept under a bed, surrounded by weighted objects whenever the suspect left the home, and being monitored closely at other times. She stated the suspect had been gone for a period that afternoon, and that she had recognized an opportunity to escape by pushing aside the objects around her. After managing to free herself, she ran from the house into the wooded area before arriving at the road where Nutter encountered her. Deputies accompanied Jamie to the location she indicated. There, they secured the property and conducted a preliminary sweep. Initial observations confirmed her description. Interior furnishings, storage containers, and physical arrangements were consistent with a structured attempt to conceal someone inside the home. Items belonging to Jamie were found inside the residence, corroborating her account. The layout of the space, isolated, quiet, and distant from typical foot traffic, matched the profile of a location selected specifically to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Patterson was transported to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office for questioning. Investigators familiar with abduction cases noted the significance of his immediate acknowledgement of involvement. During the first recorded interview, Patterson described encountering Jamie months earlier near her home while driving to work. He stated that he had decided shortly after that moment to take her, though he had not known her name at the time. According to investigators, he admitted to making prior attempts, but had abandoned them due to activity at the residence. His statements were delivered in a quiet, controlled tone, without signs of agitation. The details Patterson provided aligned with the timeline established months earlier. The early morning arrival at the Kloss residence, forced entry, and removal of Jamie in a matter of minutes. He gave investigators a description of his actions following the abduction, including the manner in which he restricted Jamie's movements and attempted to prevent detection. The consistency between his statements and the evidence inside the residence in Gordon streamlined the verification process. As news spread that Jamie had been found alive, the Sheriff's Department and FBI prepared coordinated public statements. Due to the sensitivity of the case and Jamie's age, they refrained from releasing specific details of her confinement or escape. The primary message emphasized her safety, the arrest of the suspect, and the continuation of the investigative process. Authorities highlighted that Jamie had played an essential role in her own recovery, a fact later acknowledged publicly by multiple agencies. Family members were notified immediately. Arrangements were made for Jamie to be reunited with her aunt, who had been designated as her temporary guardian. The reunification process was conducted privately, without media presence, to ensure a controlled environment. Officials who observed the moment described it as a quiet, emotional encounter, marked by relief rather than outward displays. For the first time since October 15th, a sense of concrete progress had emerged. Investigators continued to process the Gordon residence through the night. Evidence technicians documented structural features, collected relevant items, and secured the space for extended examination. Although the investigation was now entering a different phase, one centered on prosecution rather than search. Operations. The team remained aware that Jamie's statements would guide much of what followed. For the first time since the incident began, the path forward was clear. A suspect was in custody. A survivor had been found. And the case that had remained stagnant for nearly 3 months shifted immediately into an active, forward-moving investigation. In the immediate hours following Jamie's recovery and the arrest of Jake Patterson, investigators began the systematic process of verifying every element of her account. Although Patterson had already acknowledged his role, standard procedure required cross-referencing all statements with physical evidence, digital records, and third-party observations. The goal was not only to confirm the accuracy of Jamie's descriptions, but also to construct a comprehensive timeline of events from October 15, 2018 through January 10, 2019. This verification process would serve as the backbone of the prosecution and ensure that no aspect of the case relied solely on confession. The residence in Gordon became the investigative focal point. Forensic technicians worked in rotating teams, documenting each room with high-resolution photography, mapping software, and detailed notes. The layout was simple, but isolated enough to explain how Jamie had been kept out of sight for nearly 3 months. In the small bedroom where she had been held, technicians documented the bed frame, the bins and weights used to restrict movement from underneath, and the surrounding objects that created a makeshift enclosure. Their positions matched James' description of the environment during periods when Patterson left the house. Marks on the floor, where patterns on the bins and indentation patterns beneath the bed provided physical corroboration. Investigators also examined clothing, fabric fibers, and adhesives found in the room. Adhesive remnants matched the type found in the bathroom at the Kloss residence. Although the adhesive was commercially common, the matching texture and cut pattern strengthened the connection between the two locations. Items belonging to Jamie, including clothes, personal effects, and bedding, were collected, establishing continuity between her disappearance and her recovery. Digital forensics teams examined devices recovered from Patterson's residence, including a computer, a phone, and a small external drive. Contrary to concerns in similar cases, they found no evidence of coordination with others, no communication suggesting outside assistance, and no digital surveillance of the Kloss family. The absence of search histories or stored content involving Jamie initially appeared unusual. However, this aligned with Patterson's claim that he avoided electronic activity related to the crime to prevent detection. Instead, forensic analysts uncovered indications that Patterson lived in significant isolation, with limited social contact and no active personal relationships. His online activity patterns were minimal and did not show signs of prior offenses or planning beyond the act itself. Simultaneously, interrogation sessions continued under controlled conditions. Patterson remained calm, cooperative, and consistent in his statements. Investigators observed no attempts to deflect responsibility or fabricate external motives. His account of identifying Jamie while passing her school bus stop on a work commute matched bus route data and timestamps from his former workplace. Employment records placed him on a relevant route in late September. He acknowledged making 2 aborted attempts to take her prior to October 15th. Both halted because activity inside the house indicated potential witnesses. One notable aspect of Patterson's statements concerned his assertion that the crime was motivated by an impulse triggered the moment he saw Jamie for the first time. Investigators examined this claim with caution, comparing it with behavioral indicators. While no digital trail suggested prolonged planning, his steps on the day of the incident, covering his vehicle's plates, wearing a mask, ensuring minimal trace, demonstrated preparation inconsistent with spontaneous action. Prosecutors later characterized Patterson's conduct as deliberate, supported by the sequence of decisions and the measures he took to avoid detection. To reconstruct events from the night of the abduction, detectives revisited dispatch logs, timestamps from the 911 call, and movement patterns identified through neighborhood interviews. The 4-minute gap between the 911 call and deputies' arrival remained a point of emphasis. Patterson stated he had driven only a short distance down the road before pulling over to hide as patrol cars passed. Deputies who responded that night confirmed seeing no suspicious vehicle, which aligned with Patterson's explanation of having turned off his lights and remaining stationary as they drove by. The transport route from Barron to Gordon also underwent detailed review. Surveillance cameras along main roads were checked once more, using the time frames Patterson provided. Winter conditions, limited camera coverage, and the rural geography meant that many sections lacked footage. However, the absence of contradictory evidence allowed investigators to accept Patterson's description, especially after Jamie's details independently matched his statements. Interviews with Patterson's relatives and former acquaintances added context. None described him as openly aggressive. Most referred to him as withdrawn, quiet, and more inclined toward solitary activities than social interaction. These characterizations matched his lifestyle, but did not hint at the underlying capacity to carry out the events established by the investigation. His employment history showed brief periods of work followed by resignation or dismissal, though no records indicated behavioral concerns leading to those separations. In conjunction with the forensic review, Investigators revisited earlier tips submitted in the weeks after Jamie's disappearance. Their objective was to determine whether any prior report had indirectly referred to Patterson. Among the thousands of leads, none clearly matched him. The vehicle he used was not linked to suspicious activity reported earlier, and no neighbors had noted unusual behavior at the Gordon property. The absence of sightings reinforced the conclusion that Patterson's method of confinement and limited movement had largely insulated Jamie from public detection. Meanwhile, formal interviews with Jamie proceeded cautiously. Investigators prioritized psychological support and ensured the environment remained stable. Jamie provided step-by-step recollections, focusing on procedural details rather than emotional interpretation. She described how Patterson kept her under the bed using weighted bins whenever visitors arrived or he left the home. She recalled brief periods of being allowed outside the house under supervision, always in controlled conditions to prevent her from being seen. Her descriptions remained consistent across sessions, supporting the credibility of her account without requiring repetitive questioning. One of the pivotal details Jamie provided concerned Patterson's absence on the day of her escape. She stated that he had instructed her to remain under the bed while he left for several hours. She waited until she heard no additional movement, then pushed her way out and left the house through a door that was not fully secured. This detail provided investigators with a critical understanding of how she had managed to leave without resistance and how quickly she sought help once outside. The legal team preparing the case against Patterson worked closely with investigators to ensure all statements and evidence were preserved in accordance with procedural requirements. Prosecutors evaluated the charges available under Wisconsin law, focusing on intentional homicide for the deaths of James and Denise, and the charge of kidnapping for Jamie's abduction. Analysts reviewed Patterson's statements regarding his actions inside the home and during the 88-day period to determine whether additional charges might apply. While some jurisdictions might have considered further counts based on confinement conditions, Wisconsin statutes guided the specific set of charges presented to the court. As January progressed, the case shifted toward pre-trial preparation. Patterson's cooperation simplified certain elements, but prosecutors remained cautious. A voluntary confession, while significant, could not substitute for a solid evidentiary foundation. The physical evidence from both homes, Jamie's statements, digital records, and Patterson's own explanations all aligned, creating a cohesive narrative of events. The prosecution's goal was to present a case grounded entirely in verifiable fact. The investigation also required careful coordination with the family. Jamie's return created a delicate balance between privacy and public interest. Law enforcement maintained limited disclosures to protect her well-being and avoid speculation. Her aunt and uncle prepared their home for her long-term care, following guidance from child specialists and trauma counselors. By the end of the month, the investigation had reached a point of procedural clarity. The primary questions surrounding the abduction had been answered, the offender was in custody, and the timeline had been reconstructed with precision. Only the legal proceedings remained. In the weeks following the sentencing, the focus of the case shifted away from the courtroom and returned to the individuals and community who had lived with uncertainty for nearly 3 months. Jamie's return created a period defined not by legal deadlines, but by the gradual re-establishment of daily life. Her placement with her aunt and uncle in Barron County provided a stable environment, though stability in this context required careful structure. Specialists who had worked with survivors of long-term confinement advised that recovery would unfold in phases, not through abrupt changes. They emphasized the need for predictable routines, controlled exposure to public attention, and the avoidance of unnecessary interviews. The family followed these recommendations closely. Jamie adapted quietly to her new environment. Observers noted that she engaged in simple routines, meals at consistent times, short walks, scheduled counseling sessions, each serving as a way of reintroducing normalcy without pressure. Investigators who maintained contact with the family reported that Jamie displayed a clear understanding of her circumstances and a strong sense of agency, something that had been evident in the decisive way she escaped. At the same time, she navigated a world that had changed during her absence, one where her name had become widely recognized and where public interest remained intense despite the legal conclusion of the case. For the Barron community, the resolution brought a mixture of relief and contemplation. Residents who had taken part in searches or had placed flyers around the region now faced the reality of a case that had ended not through collective discovery, but through the determination of the child who had disappeared. That fact shaped community discussions in subtle ways. People spoke about vigilance and preparedness, about the importance of acting promptly when something appears unusual, and about the thin line between routine life and unforeseen intrusion. Town officials worked with local organizations to review response protocols and communication systems, acknowledging that the rapid involvement of statewide and federal resources had been essential, but that community-level awareness also had a role. Law enforcement agencies conducted internal reviews of the case, identifying points where the investigation had proceeded effectively and areas where new tools or training could strengthen future responses. The rapid arrival of deputies on the night of the 911 call remained one of the most notable features in the early timeline. Investigators frequently referenced that 4-minute window, both because it showed procedural readiness and because it illustrated how narrow the margin can be between intervention and escape. Discussions around improving surveillance coverage in rural environments resurfaced, though the practical challenges of wide geographic areas remained a persistent barrier. As time passed, Jamie's presence became more private. Media outlets, aware of her age and the sensitivity of her experience, adhered to guidelines limiting exposure. Public statements were released through family representatives, focusing on gratitude toward law enforcement and community members, rather than on the personal details of Jamie's recovery. Professionals involved in her care emphasized that her ability to make decisions about her own daily life was a critical part of the healing process. Small choices, what activities to pursue, how to structure her day, where to go, helped restore a sense of autonomy. One of the more profound long-term effects emerged through Jamie's involvement, albeit indirectly, in advocacy efforts. Organizations dedicated to missing and exploited children referenced her case in training materials and educational programs, highlighting the importance of community vigilance and the need to believe in the resilience of young survivors. Although Jamie did not make frequent public statements, her story influenced how professionals discussed survival, self-protection, and the capacity of children to act decisively under extreme pressure. Specialists noted that her escape demonstrated not only a moment of opportunity, but also months of observation, planning, and internal resolve. The Kloss family home in Barron, which had been the site of the original crime, remained a sensitive location. After the investigation concluded, the property no longer served an evidentiary purpose. Discussions within the community centered on whether the house should remain standing or whether a different use should be considered. Eventually, the property passed into private handling. Residents acknowledged that while physical structures hold memories, a community's relationship with a location depends on how it chooses to integrate or release the past. For law enforcement personnel closely involved with the case, the resolution carried a particular weight. Detectives who had worked daily through the silent weeks of the investigation spoke about the difficulty of continuing to review leads that produced no tangible result. They explained that missing child cases often impose a unique pressure. The possibility of recovery remains alive for as long as evidence does not prove otherwise. When Jamie was found alive, that possibility transformed into an outcome seldom achieved in similar investigations. The case became a reference point for training programs, highlighting both the challenges of rural abductions and the importance of maintaining commitment even when evidence remains scarce. As for Jake Patterson, his transfer to an out-of-state facility reduced the likelihood of ongoing public focus within Wisconsin. Corrections officials placed him in a secure environment where contact with the general inmate population was limited. Records from the receiving institution indicated that he adhered to routine schedules and followed staff instructions without incident. This behavior, while noted in administrative reports, did not alter the reality of his legal situation. His sentence ensured that he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life, and the court's decision removed any possibility of future release. Years after the resolution, the case continues to be referenced not for the nature of the crime alone, but for the fact that the missing child returned. Advocates, investigators, and community members frequently point to the case as evidence that disappearances do not always end where the early facts suggest they might. Jamie's escape demonstrated that even under prolonged confinement, the opportunity for recovery can emerge unexpectedly. In the broader context of public safety, the case prompted renewed discussions about rural vulnerability, the limitations of law enforcement surveillance in isolated areas, and the role of community awareness. Families became more attentive to communication routines. Schools reviewed their procedures for identifying irregular activity near bus stops, and regional agencies coordinated more closely on missing juvenile alerts. Despite these practical considerations, the most enduring element of the case remains the simple act of Jamie walking out of the woods into the path of a passing neighbor. That moment marked the point where the trajectory of the case shifted entirely. It turned a months-long investigation with no clear direction into a documented recovery. It connected a child who had been missing to a community that had been searching, and it provided a rare conclusion in a category of cases where answers are often incomplete. If you want to follow more cases that examine missing persons and the investigations behind them, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts. Tell me where you're watching from, and which part of the Jamie Kloss case stands out to you the most.